Tonight, we begin a quiet journey together, a journey that will carry you deep into rest and plant gentle seeds of peace within the garden of your mind. There is nothing you need to achieve here. No effort, no discipline, no goal. These are not lessons to be memorized, but soft reminders of truths you have always known, truths that live quietly within you, waiting to be remembered. Before we begin, take a slow breath. Notice where you are. Perhaps whisper to yourself what time it is, or where in the world you are listening from. Because even though distance may separate us, this silence connects us always and everywhere. The wisdom of Zen teaches that peace is not something we must build. It is something we must reveal, like a mountain lake that becomes cloudy only when disturbed. When the water settles, clarity returns on its own. So it is with the mind. When we struggle, when we grasp, when we chase, we stir the waters. But when we rest, when we let the ripples fade, the reflection returns clear, vast, still. As we walk together through these ancient teachings, you may notice your breath deepening on its own, your body softening, your thoughts slowing. This is not something you must force. It is the natural response of a mind remembering its own stillness. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to do. Simply breathe with me and allow yourself to arrive. In a remote valley surrounded by misty peaks, there once stood a monastery known only to a few, and within its quiet walls lived a master named Ryanen, a man known across the mountains for his wisdom, serenity, and his unmatched library of sacred texts. For more than 40 years, Ryanen devoted his life to collecting the rarest sutras, poems, and philosophical scrolls in existence. Pilgrims would cross rivers and deserts just to read in his hall, a sanctuary of words and silence. The library itself was a temple within a temple. Shelves carved from ancient cedar stretched toward the rafters. Every scroll was wrapped in silk, tied with care, and placed precisely where light could not fade its ink. The air smelled of wood, wax, and time. When dawn touched the mountains, soft gold would spill through the paper windows, casting light upon centuries of thought and devotion. Ryanen would rise before the first bell of the monastery. He would light a single candle, sit cross-legged among the shelves, and read in silence while the world outside still slept. Those hours between night and morning were his truest prayer. But one autumn night, as the moon hung pale above the valley, a wind came down from the northern pass, fierce, unrelenting. Within minutes, flames had caught the edges of the monastery roof. The fire spread with terrifying speed, leaping from beam to beam, turning centuries of devotion into burning light. The monks awoke to chaos bells clanging, voices shouting through the smoke. They fled into the courtyard, the air thick with sparks and ash. There was no time to save the books, no way to protect the library. The fire consumed it all. Scrolls written by hand centuries ago, texts carried across continents gone in a single night. 40 years of care, 4 decades of sacred gathering turned to ash before dawn. If this journey brought you peace, remember to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss a moment of stillness. Stay till the end and let the calm unfold. When the morning came, the monks gathered among the ruins, trembling, silent. Their faces were streaked with soot and tears. They turned to their teacher, expecting despair, expecting him to collapse beneath the weight of such loss. But Master Ryanen sat upon a stone, hands resting lightly on his knees, watching the smoke rise into the pale morning sky. His face was calm, as if the fire had burned through him as well, leaving only stillness behind. One young monk, unable to contain his sorrow, stepped forward. "Master," he said, his voice shaking, "how can you be so at peace? Everything is gone, all your books, your life's work, the wisdom of generations. How can you sit there as if nothing happened?" Ryanen turned his gaze toward the blackened earth where his beloved library once stood. A faint smile touched his lips. "My child," he said softly, "the teachings were never in the books. They were in the silence that read them." He lifted a handful of ash from the ground, let it fall through his fingers, and whispered, "The fire has taken nothing that was truly mine." The monks wept not from grief, but from the strange, luminous peace that surrounded their teacher. And as the morning sun rose over the mountain, the ashes shimmered like snow in its light. That day, Ryonen gathered his students and led them to rebuild not the library, but the garden. He said, "Let the wind be our scripture. Let the sound of the river be our sutra. The true text is written everywhere on water, on air, on the silence between two breaths." And in that moment, each monk understood something deeper than words could teach. Sometimes the universe burns away what we cling to so that we may remember what cannot be lost. The gift of loss, how destruction becomes awakening. When the flames of Ryanen's library faded into memory, a new silence settled over the mountain. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of transformation, like the quiet that follows a great storm when the air is clean and the sky impossibly wide. For days, the monks moved through the ruins with care. They gathered pieces of scorched wood, swept the ash into the earth, and bowed before what remained. Every motion was an act of reverence, a prayer offered not for what had been lost, but for what was being revealed. The fire had not only burned the books, it had burned the illusion of permanence. It had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving behind only what was real. Master Ryanen walked among his students, his robes streaked with soot, his steps unhurried. To those who wept for the lost words, he said, "The fire was a teacher. It came not to destroy, but to show us what cannot be burned." He looked toward the horizon, where smoke still rose faintly against the morning sun, and added, "All that vanishes was never truly ours. Only that which watches, the vanishing that is eternal." The monks did not understand at first. Their minds were still clinging to what was gone to the scrolls, the ink, the scent of old cedar. They could not yet see that the true scripture was unfolding in their own hearts. But over time, they began to feel it, a strange likeness where grief had been, something soft, wordless, and infinite. There is a truth hidden in every loss, but it can only be seen when the eyes of resistance close. When we stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begin to whisper, "What is this showing me?" Loss, when held gently, becomes a kind of grace. It pulls away what we cling to, revealing what was always waiting underneath. Imagine a tree in autumn. Each leaf that falls seems like a small death. But the tree does not resist. It does not mourn what the wind takes away. It knows the falling is necessary, that the emptiness will prepare it for another season of growth. So too with us, when the fires of life sweep through, when what we love turns to ash, we can either reach into the smoke, trying desperately to reclaim what's gone, or we can bow before the lesson that is arriving. Ryonen once told his students, "Attachment is like holding on to a rope that burns your hands. You think you are saving yourself, but the tighter you grip, the deeper the pain." He would then smile gently and add, "When you finally let go, you do not fall, you float." As the seasons passed, the monastery was rebuilt, but not in the same way. Where once there were endless shelves of paper, now there were gardens and open courtyards. Where there had been walls, there was sky. Ryonen said, "Let this place breathe as we must learn to breathe." Each morning, he would gather his students beneath a great oak and speak softly of impermanence, of loss, of the beauty of change. He told them stories not from books, but from the quiet wisdom of observation. He would point to the morning dew and say, "This is the scripture of dawn." He would listen to the river and whisper, "This is the sound of truth flowing." He would close his eyes, place a hand upon his heart, and say, "This is where the real library has always been." The monks learned that the fire had not taken their teachings, it had freed them from the illusion that wisdom lives on paper. It had shown them that enlightenment cannot be bound to ink or page, because it breathes in every heartbeat and shines in every fleeting moment. One evening, a young monk approached Ryonen as they watched the sunset. He said, "Master, I have been thinking about the fire. I still cannot understand why something so sacred had to be destroyed." Ryonen smiled, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the sky. "Tell me," he said, "what happens when a candle burns?" The monk hesitated. "The wax melts, the flame consumes it, and then the light fades." "Yes," said Ryonen, "but where does the light go?" The student thought for a long while, then shook his head. "I do not know." Ryonen nodded. "Exactly. You cannot point to where it went, because the light was never something that could be lost. It was the expression of the wax, not the wax itself. The light was always free." He turned back toward the horizon. Our lives, our work, our possessions, they are the wax, the spirit, the awareness, the love that is the flame. When the wax is gone, the light returns to the whole. The young monk felt something stir within him, a peace that words could not reach. He realized that the library had not perished, it had simply changed its form. Its wisdom now lived in their breath, their actions, their silence. That night, as the moon rose over the valley, the monks sat together in meditation. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The stars hung like silent witnesses above them, and as they breathed in unison, they felt the truth of their master's teaching that even in loss there is nothing missing, that destruction is only a doorway to deeper seeing. The fire had taken away what could be burned, but it had left untouched what was infinite. And that infinite peace, that unshakable stillness became the monastery's new scripture. Loss is not the end of something, it is the unveiling of what endures. When the known dissolves, the real appears quiet, formless, eternal. The next time something in your life falls away, a plan, a dream, a person, a sense of who you thought you were, pause, breathe, watch the smoke rise without judgment, and whisper, "This too is the fire of awakening." Because sometimes the greatest teachers arrive not in the form of wise words, but in the shape of endings. And when we meet those endings with open eyes, they stop being losses, they become liberations. The still point, finding peace in the space between. In every breath, there is a small, forgotten moment, a space between the inhale and the exhale. It is so brief, so subtle, that most never notice it. Yet, within that quiet pause, the entire universe rests. It is the still point, the place where time holds its breath and being simply is. Master Ryonen often spoke of this place, though he said it could never be found by searching. It reveals itself, he would whisper, when you stop trying to reach it. He once led his students down to the river at dawn. Mist hung low over the water, and the first light of morning touched the ripples like gold dust. He said, "Listen." For a while, the monks heard nothing but the murmur of water and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then Ryonen spoke again. "Do you hear the silence beneath the river's song?" The monks strained their ears. All they could hear was the current, steady and endless. "The silence," said the master, "is not the absence of sound. It is the space that allows sound to be heard. Without it, even the song of the river could not exist." He picked up a smooth stone from the riverbank and held it up. "This stone," he said, "exists because space allows it to. Sound exists because silence holds it. And you, my students, exist because awareness holds you. That awareness, that still point, is your true home." The monks bowed, and in that moment, the world seemed to stand still. The water continued to flow, the wind continued to move, but beneath it all, there was something unmoving, a presence vast and timeless, quiet and infinite. That evening, Ryonen sat alone beneath the old oak tree, watching fireflies rise from the grass like floating stars. A young monk approached quietly and asked, "Master, what is this stillness you speak of? Is it found in meditation, or is it something we must earn through discipline?" Ryonen smiled. "The stillness you seek has never been lost," he said. "It is here, between each thought, between each heartbeat, between each moment of wanting and becoming." The monk furrowed his brow. "But how do I reach it?" The master's eyes softened. "By not reaching." He lifted his hand and drew a circle in the air. "Imagine the surface of a lake," he said. "When the wind stirs, the surface ripples. The reflections distort, you see fragments, not the whole. But when the wind ceases, the lake returns to stillness, and the reflection becomes clear." He paused, letting the silence stretch between them. "The ripples are your thoughts. The wind is your effort. The still point is your true reflection, always there, waiting beneath the surface." The monk closed his eyes, listening to the hum of crickets and the soft breath of night. He felt his thoughts swirl, then settle. For a brief moment, there was no inside or outside, no self, no sound, only peace. When he opened his eyes, the master was smiling. "You see," he said softly, "you did not go anywhere. You simply stopped leaving." Days turned to weeks, and the monks continued their practice not of achieving, but of allowing. They learned to bow not only before their teacher, but before each moment as it arrived. The steam rising from a bowl of tea, the sound of rain on the roof, the warmth of sunlight through the paper window, each became a doorway to stillness. Ryonen often reminded them, the mind searches for peace, as if it were a place, a destination at the end of effort. But peace is not something you reach, it is what remains when you stop searching. Sometimes he would stand in the garden after a long rain and simply watch the droplets slide from the leaves. When a monk asked what he was doing, he said, "I am listening to stillness move." The monk looked confused. "Master, how can stillness move?" Ryanen smiled faintly. Just as music moves through silence, just as life moves through death, just as truth moves through everything. There is a story told about that same master, one that the monks would whisper for generations. One evening, a visitor arrived at the monastery, a scholar from the city, renowned for his intellect and his questions. He had heard of Ryanen's wisdom and came seeking answers. The scholar bowed deeply and said, "Master, I have read hundreds of scriptures, studied countless philosophies, yet I cannot find peace. Please, teach me the essence of stillness." Ryanen said nothing. He poured tea into the visitor's cup and kept pouring. The cup overflowed, spilling across the table and onto the floor. The scholar jumped back. "Stop! The cup is full." Ryanen looked at him calmly. "Exactly," he said. "How can I show you stillness when your mind is already full of noise?" The scholar's face softened. He bowed once more, and in that bow, the first crack of humility opened a space for stillness to enter. Stillness cannot be forced. It comes when you make room for it. It arrives in the spaces between doing and being, between effort and surrender, between the inhale and the exhale. You do not have to stop thinking to be still. You only need to stop believing every thought that passes by. Each thought is like a wave on the ocean, temporary, beautiful, and incapable of disturbing the depth below. Close your eyes now, if you wish. Listen to your breath. Notice the pause at the top of each inhale and the pause at the bottom of each exhale. That is the still point, the quiet doorway between moments. Step through it gently. Do not chase it. Do not name it. Just allow yourself to rest there, in the silence that holds all things. In the seasons that followed, the monastery changed once more. New monks arrived, old ones departed. The gardens grew wild, then bloomed again with spring. But through every change, the same stillness remained a quiet awareness, unmoved by the passing of years. And if you visit that mountain even now, you might find a single monk sitting by the river, watching the water flow, his breath slow and steady. He will not call what he's doing meditation. He will simply call it remembering. For that is what stillness truly is, not an escape from life, but a return to the part of you that has never been carried away. When your mind feels restless, when your thoughts race like the wind, remember this: you are not the ripples. You are the lake. You are not the breath. You are the space that breathes. You are not the movement. You are the still point through which all things move. Rest there, dear one, in that timeless silence where nothing needs to be added and nothing can be taken away. That is peace. That is home. The mirror and the moon, seeing the true self beyond illusion. There is an ancient parable told in the monastery that when the moon looks into the lake, it believes itself to be broken. Each ripple shatters its reflection. Each breeze distorts its form until the moon forgets that it has ever been whole. But the truth is simple. The moon was never broken, only the surface through which it was seen. Many years after Ryanen's passing, a young monk named Satori arrived at the monastery gates. He was thin, pale, and carried eyes that looked far older than his age. When the gatekeeper asked what he sought, Satori whispered, "I wish to see my true face." He was taken to the elder, who now led the monastery, a quiet woman named Mei-Lin, once a disciple of Ryanen. Her hair had turned silver, but her presence carried the same stillness that had once filled her teacher. Satori bowed and said, "Master Mei Lin, I have meditated for years. I have studied the sutras and fasted for clarity. Yet my reflection remains cloudy. Who am I, truly?" Mei Lin smiled softly. She pointed to the pond outside her hut. "Go there tonight," she said, "and watch the moon until you find your answer." That night, the air was cool and alive with the scent of cedar. The pond shimmered beneath the silver light of the moon. Satori knelt by the water's edge, his knees pressing into the damp earth. He stared into the pond. The moon stared back whole, luminous, serene. But then a breeze passed, and the reflection trembled. It bent, broke, and reformed in 1,000 fragments of light. Satori frowned. He waited for the image to steady, but every few moments another ripple came, distorting the moon once more. Hours passed. The wind quieted, then rose again. Each time, Satori's heart mirrored the water calm, then disturbed. He began to weep. When Mei Lin came at dawn, she found him still kneeling, his eyes red and tired. He looked up and whispered, "Master, the moon cannot be seen clearly. The water is too restless. I cannot find my true reflection." Mei Lin smiled and knelt beside him. "The moon has not changed," she said. "It is only the pond that forgets how to be still." She touched the surface lightly with her fingertip. "Your mind is this water. Your thoughts are its ripples. When you believe them, you mistake the reflection for the truth." Satori's tears fell into the pond, sending out small, perfect rings of motion. He watched them fade, one by one. Then he understood. For days he sat by the pond, doing nothing but watching. At first, the mind resisted, old memories rose, questions demanded answers, desires whispered their familiar songs. But Satori no longer chased them. He let them drift past like leaves in the current. He simply watched. Watched the ripples form and fade, watched the wind move through branches, watched his breath soften. And then one morning, something strange happened. As the sun began to rise, he realized he could no longer tell where his breath ended and the world began. The pond shimmered, the trees swayed, and the sky opened like a deep, endless mirror reflecting itself within itself. He laughed, softly at first, then fully, freely, not because he had found something, but because he had stopped searching. That evening, he returned to Mei Lin. Before he could speak, she said, "You have seen your face." Satori bowed deeply. "Yes," he said. "It was never mine to see." She nodded. "The mirror does not hold the image. It allows it to appear." She walked with him to the edge of the courtyard, where the first stars began to bloom in the twilight. "The true self," she said, "is like space. It holds everything, but clings to nothing. It is not your body, not your thoughts, not even your awareness of being aware. It is the silence that lets all of this unfold." Satori asked quietly, "Then what am I to do with this knowing?" Mei Lin's smile deepened. "Live, laugh, sweep the floor, share tea with others. Let the knowing vanish in the ordinary. That is where truth breathes." Years passed. Satori remained at the monastery, teaching not with words but through presence. He would often sit with the novices under the old oak tree, the same one that Ryanan had once sat beneath. When asked about enlightenment, he would pick up a fallen leaf, twirl it between his fingers, and ask, "Does this leaf know it has fallen? Or is it still part of the wind that carried it here?" The novices would stare, puzzled. He would smile and say nothing more. One day, a child from the nearby village wandered into the monastery. He was lost, frightened, and crying. Satori found him by the gate, kneeling in the dust. The monk lifted the child gently and carried him to the kitchen, where he gave him warm rice and water. When the boy had eaten, he asked, "Sir, are you God?" Satori chuckled. "No," he said. "I'm just someone who stopped pretending not to be." The boy blinked. "I don't understand." "You will," Satori said, "when you grow quiet enough to listen to the silence inside your heartbeat." That night, the child slept peacefully in the temple. Satori watched over him as candlelight flickered across the walls. Outside, the moon rose once more, whole and untouched, reflected perfectly in the still pond. Satori whispered into the night, "The mirror is clear. The moon has never been broken." And for a moment, everything, the stars, the wind, the earth, the breath, felt like one vast breathing silence. Because, in the end, that is the great secret of awakening. You do not dissolve into nothingness. You realize that nothingness has always been everything. You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the ocean, momentarily dreaming itself as a drop. And when that dream ends, there is no loss, no death, no separation, only the moon, forever whole, shining upon the still water of your being. The wind that remembers, lessons on letting go. There are things the wind remembers: the scent of summer rain on the fields, the songs whispered by monks through temple corridors, the soft rustle of robes as they sweep the courtyard at dawn. It carries the laughter of children long grown, the sigh of old trees bending in twilight, and the silent prayers of those who seek peace but do not yet know they already are peace. The wind does not cling to what it carries. It touches everything and moves on. Years after Satori's awakening, he had grown old, his hair now white, his movements slow, but his eyes still clear as the morning sky after rain. The monastery had changed. New halls had been built. The old oak had fallen and sprouted again, and a younger generation had filled the courtyards with the hum of chants and the sound of wooden sandals on stone. One evening, Satori sat with a small group of students beside the incense garden, where the smoke rose in delicate spirals and vanished into the amber glow of dusk. A novice named Anzu asked, "Master, we study detachment every day. We repeat the teachings. We meditate. Yet I still feel sorrow when things fade, when a friend leaves, when a flower withers, when the day turns into night. How can I truly let go?" Satori smiled. He picked up a small stick and traced a circle in the sand. "Tell me," he said, "when the circle disappears beneath the wind, where does it go?" Anzu frowned. "It doesn't go anywhere. The wind just moves the sand." "Exactly," said Satori. "Nothing is lost, only rearranged. The form changes, but the essence remains." They sat in silence for a while. The cicadas sang their evening chorus. The first stars began to bloom in the indigo sky. Then Satori continued, "When I was young, I thought letting go meant losing, that to release something was to say goodbye forever. But life has shown me that letting go is simply allowing what wishes to move to move." He lifted his hand and let the breeze pass through his fingers. "You see, Anzu, we hold on to moments because we fear emptiness. We believe that without our grip, the world will vanish, that love will end, that joy will leave, that we will be forgotten. But the truth is far kinder. Love is not held. It flows. Like this wind, it touches and keeps moving, carrying traces of everyone it has ever brushed." Anzu looked down at the sand, where the circle had long disappeared. The night had grown deep and quiet. "Master," she said softly, "when you die, what will happen to you?" Satori smiled, not sadly, not proudly, just gently, like a man watching the tide return to the sea. "I will become what I have always been," he said, "the wind that remembers." That night, a storm rolled through the mountains. Rain lashed the temple roofs, and the monks took shelter by candlelight. But Satori sat by the window of his small hut, watching the lightning dance across the valley. He remembered his teacher, Mei Lin, and her teacher, Rionen, and all those who had walked this path before him. Each had left behind not monuments, but moments' ripples in the still pond of being. And as the rain fell, he whispered to the darkness, "I am ready to move as you move, to flow as you flow." When morning came, the storm had passed. The mountains shimmered with mist. The monks found Satori seated by his window, his body still, his face peaceful. On the low table beside him was a note written in brush and ink. "Do not build a shrine for me. Sweep the floor, feed the birds, listen to the rain. And when the wind passes your cheek, know that I am still breathing with you." For many years after his passing, the monks noticed something peculiar. Whenever a storm approached, the incense smoke in the temple would shift and circle in perfect spirals, as if carried by invisible hands. They would smile and whisper, "Satori is sweeping again." And so, the monastery lived on, not as a place of walls and altars, but as a living echo of all who had walked before. Ryanen's fire, Mei Lin's stillness, Satori's laughter, they had not vanished. They had simply changed form, become part of the great, remembering wind that moves through everything. Because, in truth, nothing ever really ends. The wave returns to the ocean, but the ocean never forgets the shape of the wave. When the monks taught new students, they no longer spoke of enlightenment as something to be reached. They spoke of it as something to be remembered. The Buddha, they would say, is not waiting in the heavens. He is the breath you are taking now. He is the sound of the rain on the roof, the warmth of your tea, the silence between your thoughts. And as the temple bell echoed across the valley, its sound rising and fading like a single breath, the wind would move again through the cedars, soft, ancient, carrying the fragrance of wisdom that never grows old. Because the path of peace is not found in escaping the world, but in embracing it fully. Every laugh, every loss, every breath, every letting go. When you cease to clutch at the passing, you realize that nothing truly passes. It all moves in endless rhythm, the same music playing through countless forms. And when you finally rest in that rhythm, when you stop struggling against the dance, you understand what the masters meant all along. You are not in the wind. You are the wind. The sound of one breath, the end of seeking. Dawn arrived quietly that morning. Mist coiled around the monastery's eaves like the memory of dreams not yet gone. The temple bell rang soft, deliberate, each tone rising into the mountain air, then fading into silence so complete it almost hummed. For those who listened closely, the silence after the bell felt fuller than the sound itself, a vastness that held the world in its open palms. In that hush, the monks began their morning meditation. The smell of wet cedar drifted through the open doors, and a thin ribbon of incense wound upward, vanishing into the stillness above. No one spoke, no one needed to. The breath of each monk merged with the breath of the others, until there was no each. There was only breathing one continuous rhythm of life, expanding and contracting like the tide. Among them sat Anzu, the student who had once asked Satori how to let go. Now she had become the monastery's teacher. Her hair was streaked with silver, but her gaze held the warmth of a sunrise after long rain. As she sat in meditation, she remembered the first time she had met Satori, how restless her heart had been, how desperate she was to grasp peace, as though peace was something fragile she might drop. Now she understood what her master had meant when he spoke of the wind that remembers. Peace was not a possession to be earned, it was the nature of everything. Even the sound of her own breath was not hers. It was the mountain breathing, the trees exhaling through her lungs, the rhythm of existence expressing itself in one gentle motion. She smiled, and in that smile, decades of seeking dissolved like dew beneath the morning sun. Later that day, a young traveler arrived at the monastery gates. He was dusty from the road, his sandals worn thin. He bowed deeply before Anzu. "Teacher," he said, "I have traveled far to find this place. I have read the sutras, studied the teachings, and yet my heart is still troubled. How do I find peace?" Anzu regarded him quietly. She poured tea into 2 cups and handed him one. "Drink," she said. The traveler drank. The tea was warm and slightly bitter. "Do you taste the tea?" Anzu asked. "Yes, teacher." "Then peace is already here." The traveler frowned. "I don't understand." Anzu smiled. "Peace is not hidden. It is what remains when you stop trying to understand." That night, after the traveler had fallen asleep in the guest hall, Anzu walked to the temple courtyard. The moon was high, its light silvering the stones, and the sound of the river below murmured like a mantra. She closed her eyes and listened, not for words, but for the space between them. For a moment, she thought she heard her master's voice, Satori's soft laughter carried by the breeze. "Nothing is missing, Anzu," it seemed to say. "Even your longing is part of the whole." Years later, Anzu too grew old. When her time came, she gathered the monks beneath the same oak tree where generations before her had sat in silence. She said, "My beloved friends, we have walked this path together, but the path itself was never separate from us. There is nowhere to go. There is only this moment, this breath, this sound of wind through leaves." She paused and looked up at the sky. Clouds drifted like slow-moving continents of light. "When I was young," she continued, "I wanted to find the truth. Now I see truth was never hiding. It was simply waiting for me to stop searching." She laughed softly, freely. "Even now, do not cling to these words. Let them pass through you like air through a flute. The song does not belong to the flute. It belongs to the silence that moves through it." That night, Anzu passed peacefully in her sleep, her breath fading into the rhythm of the wind. The monks awoke to find a small piece of parchment beside her bed. It read, "The sound of one breath is the sound of eternity. The one who listens is the one who breathes. Rest here. There is nothing more to seek." And so the monastery continued, its bells ringing through the centuries, its teachings carried by the mountain wind. Travelers still come weary from their long journey through thought and striving seeking answers, and finding instead the taste of tea, the rhythm of breath, the stillness between heartbeats. Some stay for a day, some stay for a lifetime, But all eventually realized that what they were seeking was never in the temple, nor in the scriptures, nor even in the mountains. It was within them, quiet, patient, like a candle waiting to be seen. And now, dear listener, as our journey together nears its end, perhaps you too can hear it, the soft echo of that same breath, moving through your chest, calm, effortless, eternal. This is the sound of one breath, the sound of the world awakening through you. There is nothing more to find, nothing more to fix, nothing more to become. You have arrived, not at a destination, but at the heart of being itself. So rest now. Let the words fade. Let your thoughts settle like snow in a silent forest. And as you drift into sleep, remember you are not the seeker nor search. You are the silence that holds them both. Welcome home. Before the first dawn, the empty sky within. Before the first dawn, there is a silence so complete that even the stars seem to hold their breath. The world stands suspended between night and light, a soft, eternal pause where time forgets to move. It is said that in this moment, before the first bird sings, and before the horizon blushes with gold, the true nature of existence whispers to those who can listen, not in words, not in visions, but in the quiet knowing that has no edges, no beginning, and no end. Many years after Anzu's passing, the monastery still stood on its mountain slope, its rooftops shimmering beneath the changing sky. Generations of monks had come and gone, their laughter, their footsteps, their prayers woven into the stones like breath into the body. And though centuries passed, something in that place remained untouched, a stillness that lived beneath the noise of time. It was said that if one sat long enough in the meditation hall and truly surrendered the effort to be still, the mountain itself would begin to breathe through you. The air there was like nowhere else, crisp with pine and snowmelt, but carrying the warmth of human devotion, as though the earth had been softened by centuries of silence. One cold winter morning, long after the world beyond the monastery had changed beyond recognition, a young woman named Hana arrived at its gates. She came not as a scholar or pilgrim, but as a wanderer, someone who had lost her way not in the forest, but in herself. Her eyes carried the weight of years spent searching through cities and books, through fleeting joys and unending questions. She had read of this monastery in an old manuscript, a place where the wind whispered the teachings of long-departed masters. So she climbed for 3 days through fog and frost until she reached its doors. When the gatekeeper asked her what she sought, she said simply, "I'm tired of looking for peace. I just want to stop." The gatekeeper smiled as if he'd heard those words before. He bowed and said, "Then you are already halfway home." Hana was given a small cell beside the north wall, where a single paper window let in the pale winter light. Her bed was a straw mat, her comfort silence. For days, she followed the monks in their routine, rising before dawn, sweeping the courtyard, eating rice and broth in stillness, and meditating by candlelight. At first, her mind rebelled. It screamed for movement, for noise, for answers. Her thoughts tangled like vines, pulling her in 100 directions. But no one here seemed interested in fighting their minds. They simply watched, as though the storm itself were part of the practice. Slowly, Hana began to soften. The noise in her head, once deafening, became the background hum of something deeper, a vast space beneath thought, where peace was not something she created, but something that simply was. One morning before dawn, she went to the old pond behind the meditation hall, the same pond where Satori had once watched the moon. The surface was still and dark, reflecting a single star trembling in its depths. As she gazed at it, a faint sound reached her not from outside, but from within. It was the rhythm of her own breathing, soft, steady, eternal. She realized that every inhalation was a birth, and every exhalation a letting go. She had been dying and being reborn countless times each moment, and had never once noticed. Tears filled her eyes not from sadness, but from recognition. In that moment, she understood what the masters had meant when they spoke of the empty sky within. It was not emptiness that lacked. It was emptiness that held everything. The same stillness that carried the stars, the same silence that waited before dawn, it was here, in her chest, in her breath, in the space between each thought. That morning, as the first light crept over the horizon, Hana returned to her cell. She took up a brush and ink, and on a small scrap of paper wrote, "Before the dawn breaks, the sky holds its breath. Before the mind awakens, peace is already here." She pinned the note to her wall, then sat quietly, watching the room fill with light. No voice inside demanded meaning. No question pressed for answers. She simply sat, and for the first time, she was. In the seasons that followed, Hana became part of the monastery's rhythm. She tended the gardens, taught new visitors how to sit in silence, and often led evening meditations by the pond. Those who met her said that her presence felt like sunlight through fog, gentle, warming, but impossible to hold. When people asked her for wisdom, she would smile and say, "Don't look for peace. Just notice where you're standing when you stop running." Years later, when Hana too grew old, she called her students together. They gathered in the same incense garden where Anzu had once taught, and where Satori had drawn circles in the sand. The air was still, the wind carrying faint traces of pine and smoke. Hana looked around and said, "The masters before us did not leave teachings. They left silence. It is our task to listen." She closed her eyes. "When I first came here," she said, "I thought the path was about finding peace. But peace is not found. It is what remains when you realize there is no one left to find it." She lifted her hand and gestured toward the mountains. "Look," she whispered, "the sky is already awake." The monks followed her gaze. The sun had not yet risen, but the horizon glowed faintly, a breath before dawn. And as that light deepened, turning the mist to gold, turning their faces to warmth, the world felt impossibly new, as though creation itself were beginning again. No one spoke. There was no need. The silence was complete, alive, boundless. Hana passed from this world before sunrise, sitting upright in meditation. Her final breath faded into the mountain air, a sigh that mingled with the wind, the same wind that had once carried Ryonin's ashes, that had circled Mei Lin's temple, that had brushed Satori's cheek and whispered to Anzu in her dreams. The wind that remembers. Long after her passing, travelers who arrived at the monastery before dawn would sometimes speak of a strange stillness. They said that in the moment before the first bell rang, it felt as if the world was holding its breath, as if the sky itself waited for something sacred to begin. And those who were quiet enough to truly listen heard it a faint, steady rhythm, like the sound of a single breath moving through eternity. That is the sound the monks call Mujo no Ko, the voice of impermanence. It is not sad, it does not mourn. It sings softly of the beauty of things that change the way light fades, the way love shifts, the way even stars burn and vanish, only to rise again somewhere unseen. It is the voice that says, nothing is lost, everything moves, and the movement itself is holy. So now, as this story draws to a close, you too may feel that same wind on your skin, the same silence between your breaths. It does not belong to the monks or the mountain. It belongs to you and to the space that has been waiting within you all along. Before the first dawn, there was stillness. After the last sunset, there will still be stillness. And between the two, the brief, beautiful light that we call a life, the sky remains unchanged, quietly watching, quietly loving, quietly whole. You are the sky. The clouds are just passing. So breathe deeply, let go gently, and rest in the empty sky within. The eternal breath, returning to the source. There is a silence that was here before sound. There is a breath that existed before lungs, before wind, before time. And within that breath, unending, unbroken, all of creation rises and falls, like waves that never leave the ocean. The monks of the mountain used to say, between each inhale and exhale, the universe dies and is born again. But what they meant was not metaphor. They were pointing to a rhythm, a truth that beats quietly beneath all things. Even the stars breathe, though we do not hear them. Even the mountains breathe, though we cannot see their chest rise and fall. Every form from the smallest leaf to the heart of galaxies is held within this invisible tide. And we too are waves of that same ocean, forgetting for a time that we were never separate from its depths. Long after Hannah's passing, a wandering monk named Ren came to the monastery. He carried no scrolls, no lineage, no robe of status, only a small bowl and a flute carved from bamboo. He had heard stories of the place, how silence itself was the last teacher here. When he arrived, no one questioned him. He was simply given a mat and space to breathe. Days turned into months. He spoke little. He watched the mist move through the pines, listened to the echo of footsteps, and noticed how each sound disappeared into stillness, not lost, but dissolved, like a drop returning to a river. One evening, as dusk fell over the mountains, Ren walked to the same pond where Hannah once sat. The water was smooth and golden, holding the reflection of 1,000 autumn leaves drifting down from above. He picked up his flute and began to play. The sound was soft, so soft it barely disturbed the air. Each note rose, trembled, and then vanished, as if it had never existed at all. And in that moment, Ren realized something profound. The purpose of a sound was not to fill silence, but to reveal how infinite the silence truly was. For weeks after that, Ren stopped playing. He no longer felt the need. Instead, he sat by the pond and listened. He listened to the wind, how it brushed against the bamboo, how it sighed through the old temple beams. He listened to the snow falling, the whisper of his robe against the ground, the faint, rhythmic hum of his own heartbeat. He began to notice that the world was not quiet. It was endlessly speaking, but in a language that only silence could understand. And the more he listened, the more he dissolved. The Ren, who had arrived as a seeker, was slowly being washed away, grain by grain, by something greater than thought, greater than identity. One night, as he sat in meditation beneath the moon, he felt the boundary between himself and the world disappear. There was no hearing, only sound. No seeing, only light. No being, only this vast unfolding of awareness, limitless and intimate. It was as if existence itself was breathing him, and with each breath he felt both the immense sorrow and beauty of impermanence, the unending birth and death of all things. A tear rolled down his cheek. It did not fall for pain, but for wonder. At dawn, Ren climbed to the monastery's highest terrace, a place where the monks once came to greet the morning sun. The valley below was filled with fog, and the mountains looked like islands floating on a sea of light. He closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw the same sky, boundless, still, infinite. He understood now why the masters said, "The sky is not above you, it is within you." It wasn't about imagination. It was direct, visceral. The same space that held clouds and storms outside was the same space that held thoughts and feelings within. He thought of Hannah's words, "Before the dawn breaks, the sky holds its breath." And he knew what she had meant. For a brief moment, he felt himself expand not as a person, but as awareness itself. There was no monk, no mountain, no sound, only the soft pulse of creation, breathing, breathing, breathing. When Ren returned to the meditation hall later that day, he found a group of young monks gathered around a teacher, debating a passage from an old sutra. "What is the meaning of enlightenment?" one asked. "Is it realization or liberation?" another argued. "Does the self dissolve, or does it expand to include all?" The teacher smiled at them gently and said, "Ask these questions until they dissolve themselves." Ren understood. He bowed and left quietly. For he had learned that every question is like a wave asking what water is. It is not wrong to ask, but the answer can only be found when the wave stops moving. Years passed, and Ren grew old. His hair turned white as frost, and his hands trembled like leaves in wind. One evening, sensing his final days were near, he walked once more to the pond. The bamboo flute was still with him, polished smooth by decades of touch. He sat, cross-legged, as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The water shimmered with golden shadow. For a while, he said nothing, did nothing. He simply breathed. Then, without thought, he lifted the flute to his lips and played a single low note. It was unlike any sound he had ever made, soft, infinite, like the earth itself sighing after centuries of dreaming. He played another and another until the notes no longer seemed separate. They flowed together, merging with the breeze, the rustle of the trees, the rippling pond. And in that blending, the music stopped being music. It became pure presence, pure now. As the final tone faded, Ren whispered, "All sound returns to silence. All form returns to the formless. All breath returns to the source." He placed the flute on the ground beside him, closed his eyes, and smiled. When the other monks found him at dawn, he was still sitting there, bathed in light, face serene, as though listening to a sound too vast for the world to hear. After Ren's passing, his flute was placed in the temple hall. No one played it again. It was left there, a symbol of sound that had returned to stillness. Visitors often asked about it. The monks would tell his story and end with the same phrase. "The breath that played the flute still moves through us." And indeed, it did. Every breeze that passed through the monastery's gates, every sigh of wind that stirred the leaves, carried with it the same rhythm, the eternal breath. It was no longer Ren's. It was not Hana's, nor Satori's, nor Anzu's. It belonged to no one. It was everyone. To live, the monks realized, is to participate in that breath. To resist it is to suffer. To flow with it is to awaken. An awakening is not a grand event. It is simply remembering that there was never a separate you to awaken. Just breath. Just awareness. Just the eternal now, endlessly creating itself through your eyes, your hands, your heart. When the world ends, as all forms do, the breath will continue, rippling into the next silence, the next dawn, the next story, yet unwritten. E8. The whisper beyond words. If you are reading or hearing these words now, perhaps you can sense that same stillness between the lines, a quiet hum beneath the language. That is not imagination. That is the eternal breath, the living silence noticing itself through you. Pause for a moment. Breathe in slowly. Feel the air fill your chests, cool, expanding. Now breathe out soft, releasing. That's it. That's the whole path. That's what the monks, the masters, the stories were always pointing to. The source was never somewhere else. It was this breath, this awareness, this moment. Unchanging, unborn, unending. When there is no listener, only listening remains. When there is no seeker, only seeing remains. When there is no doer, only being remains. And so the story returns where it began, to silence, to stillness, to the eternal breath that continues to breathe you long after the story ends. The pathless path, where the river meets the sky. The morning light was soft that day, the kind that doesn't rise suddenly, but seeps gently into the world, like ink spreading through rice paper. Mist wrapped the mountain in thin silver veils, and every pine needle caught a single droplet of dew, each one trembling, each one reflecting the entire sky. The monastery bells did not ring that morning. There was no ceremony, no chant, no announcement of time. It was as though even the world had chosen to pause, to breathe in silence, to listen to itself. In the meditation hall, the floor was cool beneath bare feet. The faint scent of cedar and old incense lingered in the air, carrying with it memories of generations who had sat here, seeking peace, finding themselves, and finally learning there was never anything to seek at all. Many years after Ren's passing, a young traveler named Naoki arrived at the monastery gates. He was thin, his robe dusty from long roads, and his eyes carried that same restless longing that so many seekers before him had worn. The gatekeeper monk opened the door and asked softly, "What brings you to this mountain, traveler?" Naoki bowed deeply and said, "I have wandered far and read much. Every teacher tells me a different way to find peace. One speaks of effort, another of surrender. One says I must awaken through silence. Another says I must serve, speak, act. I am lost among paths. I no longer know where to walk." The gatekeeper smiled with warmth that came from decades of simplicity. "Then you have come to the right place," he said. "This is the monastery where paths end." He stepped aside, and Naoki entered. For the first few days, no one spoke to him about teachings, meditation, or enlightenment. He was simply given a mat in the corner, a bowl for rice, and a broom to sweep the courtyard. Each morning, he swept the same stone path, and each evening, fallen leaves returned to cover it again. At first, frustration gnawed at him. "What is the purpose?" he thought. "I clean, and it becomes dirty. I clear, and it fills again." But after many days of the same rhythm, his frustration began to soften. He started to notice how the act of sweeping itself became a meditation, a scrape of the broom against the stones, the crisp flutter of the leaves, the faint scent of pine rising with each movement. There was no beginning or end to his task, only this simple unfolding moment. And then, one morning, as he brushed a single golden leaf from the stone, he felt something shift inside him, a quiet click, like a lock turning open. He looked around and realized that nothing was wrong. The leaves were meant to fall. The stones were meant to be covered again, and he was meant to move among them, not to conquer nature, but to dance with it. One afternoon, Naoki was invited to sit with the abbot, an elder monk named Ryoen, whose face was carved with wrinkles that smiled even when he did not. They sat together under the shade of an ancient tree, its roots thick as arms, its bark marked by centuries of wind and rain. For a long time, neither spoke. The abbot simply watched the light shifting through the leaves. Finally, he said, "Do you hear that?" Naoki listened. He could hear birds calling, wind moving through the branches, and faintly, in the distance, the sound of water from the mountain stream. "Yes," he replied softly. Ryoen nodded. "Good. Now, who hears it?" Naoki hesitated. "I do." The old monk smiled. "Ah," he said gently, "then listen again." They sat in silence once more. This time, Naoki tried not to name what he heard. He didn't think, "This is wind" or "This is water." He just listened purely, openly. And for a brief moment, there was no listener and no sound, only the seamless hum of existence, alive, endless, whole. When Naoki opened his eyes, the abbot was still gazing at the trees. Ryoen said, "When the ear disappears, all things sing the same song." As days turned into months, Naoki spent more time alone in the mountains. He would climb to the highest ridge before dawn, sit in the cold air, and watch the first light spill over the horizon. Each sunrise was different, sometimes gold, sometimes grey, sometimes hidden entirely behind mist. But gradually, he stopped measuring beauty by colour or clarity. He began to feel beauty in the stillness itself, in the act of simply being present to whatever the sky offered. One morning, as he sat in silence, a thought drifted across his mind like a passing cloud. What if peace is not something to reach, but something that was never lost? The thought didn't come from him. It rose on its own, like mist rising from a valley. He watched it form and dissolve, and in that dissolution, he felt an immense lightness. He was no longer trying to hold the sky. He was simply the sky, endlessly open, endlessly free. It was on an evening much like this that the abbot called Naoki to join him by the river that ran along the edge of the monastery. The sun was melting into the horizon, and the surface of the water caught the fading light, turning gold and crimson. The abbot pointed toward the river and asked, "Where does this river end?" Naoki thought for a moment. "In the ocean," he said. Ryoen nodded. "And where does the ocean end?" Naoki was silent. The abbot smiled. "Do you see, my son? The river and the ocean are not two. The river's flowing is the ocean's longing. The ocean's stillness is the river's rest." He then lifted a handful of water, let it flow through his fingers, and said, "This is how all things are. Every joy, every sorrow, every breath they rise, they pass, they return. The mistake is to think that the returning means loss. It means homecoming." Naoki felt tears in his eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. The river, the mountain, the breath, they were not symbols anymore. They were himself, and himself was not separate from anything. That night, under a sky filled with stars, Naoki finally understood what the gatekeeper had meant. This is the monastery where paths end. For years, he had thought spirituality was a ladder to climb, each step bringing him closer to enlightenment. But now he saw there had never been a ladder. There was only ground, always here, always enough. The pathless path was not about going anywhere. It was the direct seeing that there was nowhere else to go. He remembered Ren's flute, Hana's dawns, the old teachings that whispered through time. All of them were rivers, and they had all led here to the ocean of this breath, this now. He closed his eyes and whispered, "There is no path to peace, for peace is the path itself." Years later, when Naoki became an elder himself, travelers often came seeking instruction. They expected philosophy, methods, or miracles. But Naoki would simply smile and say, "Come, walk with me." He would take them to the same mountain ridge and stand beside them in silence. When they grew restless, he would ask, "Can you hear the wind?" When they nodded, he would ask, "Who hears it?" And in that question, the same question his teacher once gave him, some would glimpse it, that vast, boundless awareness that needs no answer. The mountain, the sky, the silence, they were all teaching, and Naoki had learned that truth does not need to speak to be heard. When his own final day arrived, Naoki sat beneath the same ancient tree where he had once sat with Ryoen. The light was dim, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of pine. He placed his hands on his knees and whispered, "I have walked far, only to arrive where I began. I searched for peace, only to find it had been breathing me all along." He closed his eyes. Each breath grew slower, softer, until breath itself became the mountain, became the river, became the sky. And then stillness. Not absence, but fullness beyond measure. After Naoki's passing, the monks did not build a shrine or carve a statue. They planted a small sapling beside the river instead. In time, its roots reached deep into the soil, its branches stretched wide, and when the wind passed through its leaves, it sounded like distant whispering, as though the mountain itself was remembering. And sometimes, when evening fell, travelers passing by would hear a sound in the air, soft, like a flute, rising from nowhere, returning to nowhere. The monks would smile and say, "It is only the wind, but if you listen closely, you might hear what it's really saying." And so, our story ends not with a lesson, but with a breath. All that was ever sought was never lost. The peace you long for has never left you. You are not walking toward it, you are walking as it. So now, before this moment drifts away, close your eyes. Feel the air enter your lungs cool, alive. Feel it leave warm, soft. Notice that between each breath there is silence, the same silence that has carried this story from the beginning. That silence is not empty. It is full of presence, of life, of you. The seeker disappears, and only seeking remains. The teacher disappears, and only teaching remains. The story disappears, and only stillness remains. The young monk's question lingered in the cool morning air, trembling between sorrow and disbelief. His eyes searched Kozen's calm face, as if expecting, or perhaps needing, to see even a flicker of grief, a sign that his master was still human, still bound to the same ache that gripped his own heart. But Kozen only smiled, a faint curve that softened the deep lines of his weathered face. The breeze carried a wisp of smoke past them, twisting upward like a thin grey prayer to the heavens. "Tell me," Kosen said gently, "when the fire burned, did it take the sunrise with it?" The monk blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "The sunrise, master?" Kosen nodded slowly, eyes drifting toward the horizon where the first rays of gold began to spill over the charred ruins. "The fire consumed what it could reach," he continued. "Wood, silk, paper. But look, the light still comes. The birds still sing. The mountain still stands." He paused, closing his eyes as the early warmth brushed his cheeks. What was lost was only form. The essence of wisdom can never burn. The monk lowered his gaze, trying to understand. "But those scriptures, master, they were filled with sacred teachings, words of the Buddha himself. How can you not mourn their loss?" Kosen turned to him with eyes that seemed to hold both infinity and tenderness. "You believe wisdom lived in those scrolls," he said softly. "But wisdom is not ink, it is not paper. The words were only fingers pointing to the moon. If you hold on to the finger, you will never see the moon." He leaned forward, his voice a whisper that seemed to merge with the morning breeze. "All those years, I collected words about truth. Tonight, the fire gave me truth without words." The monks stood in silence. The crackling of dying embers was the only sound. One by one, they began to bow, not out of sorrow, but out of a quiet recognition that something holy had happened. The young monk felt tears on his cheeks, not of grief, but of release. He looked again at the ruins, but for the first time, he saw beyond them. In the days that followed, the monastery became a landscape of ash and possibility. The air still carried the scent of smoke, yet life began to return. Wildflowers that had lain dormant in the earth started to sprout among the blackened stones. Each day, Kosen walked among them, silent and steady, his straw sandals whispering against the charred ground. The monks rebuilt slowly, not out of urgency, but reverence. They gathered fallen wood, polished each new beam by hand, and chanted softly as they worked. There was no sadness in their labor, only devotion and a strange joy in creation itself. One evening, as the orange sun dipped low, the young monk approached Kosen once more. "Master," he said quietly, "I think I begin to understand what you meant that morning. The fire destroyed our library, but in its place, something inside me has awakened." Kosen looked at him, his expression gentle but curious. "And what is it that has awakened?" The monk hesitated, searching for the right words. "Before the fire, I worshipped knowledge," he admitted. "I thought enlightenment could be found in reading every scroll, memorizing every sutra. But now, when I sweep the courtyard, when I breathe in the scent of smoke and earth, it feels as if the teachings live there too, in the silence, in the ashes." Kosen nodded. "When the heart is ready," he said, "even the sound of sweeping becomes scripture." He gestured toward the horizon, where the sun had disappeared and twilight painted the mountains purple. "You see, my child," he continued, "life is always teaching. The fire is not the enemy. The loss is not a punishment. They are both teachers, perhaps the most honest ones we ever meet." That night, the monks gathered under the stars. With no library, no written words to read, Kosen began to speak from memory. His voice was deep and steady, carrying through the cool night air like a chant older than time itself. He told them the story of a farmer who cursed the rain because it flooded his fields, only to find that the floodwaters nourished seeds that had lain buried for years. He spoke of a sculptor who wept when her statue cracked, not realizing that the crack revealed a perfect crystal hidden within the stone. Every story was a mirror. Every word, a gentle reminder that life's seeming destruction often hides unseen blessings. When he finished, there was silence. Not empty silence, but a living one, the kind that fills the space between heartbeats, between thoughts. The monks sat there under the boundless night, breathing as one. And in that silence, they realized something profound. The teachings were not lost. They had merely changed form. Weeks passed. The monastery slowly transformed. The once grand library became a simple meditation hall, open, airy, and lined not with shelves but with cushions. Where manuscripts once stood, they now placed a single smooth stone in the center of the room, a reminder that truth, in its purest form, needs no decoration. Visitors continued to arrive, expecting to see the legendary library. Instead, they found monks sitting in silence, eyes closed, breathing in unison. Many were confused, some left disappointed, but those who stayed long enough to sit with them often left with tears of gratitude, unable to explain why. Kosen never rebuilt his collection. When asked why, he would simply smile and say, "The fire burned away everything I didn't need. What remains cannot be burned." Days melted quietly into weeks, and weeks into months. The monastery, once known for its library, was now whispered about for something far rarer. Travelers who arrived in search of texts found instead silence that seemed to hold the answers they didn't know they were seeking. There was no schedule carved in stone. The monks awoke with the dawn and bowed to the first breath of morning light. They swept the courtyard, tended the small garden, cooked rice, and moved like ripples on still water. Each act was performed as though it were the only act in the universe, unhurried, unbroken, unforced. The fire had stripped away more than possessions. It had stripped away the illusion of control. One morning, as mist drifted through the pines, the young monk, the same one who had wept for the lost library, sat alone by the stream. The water was clear and cold, moving gently over smooth stones. He dipped his hand in, watching how the current parted around his fingers and rejoined effortlessly. "Master," he said when he heard the soft crunch of Kosen's sandals behind him, "I keep thinking about impermanence, about how easily everything disappears." Kosen crouched beside him, watching the stream as if listening to its words. "Everything flows," he said simply. "The water you touch is never the same water twice. The moment you name it, it is already gone." The monk looked down. "Then how do we hold anything, Master? How do we love without fear of losing?" Kosen smiled, a smile that held no judgment, only understanding born of decades of letting go. "We do not hold," he said. "We behold. When you hold, you cling. But when you behold, you simply witness. Love that clings fears loss. Love that witnesses becomes freedom." He picked up a leaf floating by, held it between his fingers for a moment, and then let it go. "You see, to truly love is to allow the leaf to float downstream, even as your heart floats with it." The young monk's eyes glistened. The lesson landed not in his mind, but somewhere deeper, like rain softly soaking into the roots of his being. That night, a soft rain began to fall. The sound of droplets on the roof tiles echoed through the halls, rhythmic and tender. The monks gathered once again in the meditation hall, surrounding the single smooth stone that symbolized what remained after the fire. Kozen began to speak, his voice mingling with the rain. "Before the fire," he said, "I thought enlightenment could be read, that if I collected every word of truth ever written, I could awaken. But truth is not a collection, it is a clearing." He paused, letting the sound of the rain fill the silence. The fire was not my enemy. It was my teacher. It burned the walls of my mind until nothing was left to separate me from this moment. He spread his arms, palms open, as though offering his emptiness to the universe. When we lose everything, we meet who we truly are. The monks sat motionless, their breaths synchronizing, the rain drumming like a heartbeat over the world. Kozen continued, "The Buddha once said, 'All conditioned things are impermanent.' These are not words of sorrow, they are a song of freedom. Impermanence means nothing can trap us. Even grief changes, even pain flows. The fire that took the library will one day become fertile soil for new life." He looked around the hall, his eyes glimmering in the candlelight. "Do you see? The teachings did not vanish. They moved, from scrolls to smoke, from smoke to clouds, from clouds to rain. Tonight, that rain returns to us." Outside, thunder rolled softly across the mountains. The monks bowed deeply. They did not need to speak. In their hearts, they could feel the truth that the universe had not taken from them, but had only transformed. The next morning, after the rain, mist wrapped the valley like a silken robe. Drops of water clung to every branch, glistening like tiny jewels. The air smelled of pine and renewal. As the monks walked through the courtyard, they noticed something extraordinary. From the ashes of the old library, small shoots of green had begun to appear. Tiny seedlings, fragile yet determined, pushing through the blackened soil. Kozen stood among them, gazing quietly. "One fire destroys," he said softly, "and another fire gives birth. Life burns, and life begins again." He turned to his students, his eyes shining with something between joy and reverence. "Do you understand now why we must never curse what life takes? The universe is always rearranging itself in our favor, even when it looks like loss." The monks knelt, touching the new sprouts with gentle fingers. They were no longer mourning what had been lost. They were blessing what was being born. That evening, as the sun descended into amber light, Kozen gathered his disciples once more. "Let this be our new library," he said, gesturing to the young plants swaying in the wind. "Let the wind be our teacher, the rain our scripture, the fire our silent sutra." He paused, and his voice softened. "If one day another fire comes, and surely it will, welcome it too. For every ending is an invitation to meet what cannot end." And in that moment, the young monk who had once wept understood completely. He realized that the greatest teaching his master had ever given him was not a verse or a line of scripture. It was a fire that burned away everything false until only truth remained. In the months that followed the fire, the monastery entered a season of quiet transformation. Without books to study or scriptures to recite, the monks turned their attention inward. Their classroom became the valley itself, its winds, its rivers, its changing skies. Every sound, every movement, every silence carried a lesson. Kozen often walked among them, silent and smiling. He no longer lectured as he once did. Instead, his teachings came in gestures, in pauses, in the space between words. It was said that if you truly watched him pour tea, you could glimpse enlightenment in the way the liquid met the cup. One morning, before the first light touched the mountains, Kosen rang the temple bell. The sound rippled through the mist, deep and resonant, calling each monk to the courtyard. When they gathered, he said nothing at first. He stood with his hands folded, eyes half closed, breathing in the cold air. Finally, he spoke. "Today," he said, "we will practice stillness." The monks looked at one another, puzzled. They had meditated for years. What could their teacher mean by practice stillness? Kosen smiled faintly, sensing their questions. "There is stillness of body," he said, "and there is stillness of mind. But there is also the stillness of being the kind that does not depend on silence or movement. This stillness is the center of the spinning world." He gestured toward the forest path. "Follow me." They walked for an hour through whispering pines until they reached a cliff overlooking the valley. The world stretched out before them, rivers glinting like silver threads, distant villages, and mountains dissolving into clouds. The wind was gentle but constant, stirring their robes. "Sit," Kosen said softly. They sat. "Now," he continued, "do not close your eyes. Do not chase thoughts away. Do not even try to meditate. Simply be aware." The monks obeyed. Minutes passed, then hours. Birds flew across the valley. The sun climbed higher. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding over the ground. The air grew warm, carrying the scent of pine resin and wildflowers. Some monks struggled. Thoughts of hunger and fatigue crept in. Others fidgeted, uncertain how to do awareness. Kosen remained motionless, eyes open, breathing slow and deep. He looked like the mountain itself, solid, unmoving, ancient. When the sun began to set, bathing the world in gold, Kosen finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost carried away by the wind. "What did you notice?" One monk said, "I heard the wind and birds, master." Another said, "I noticed my thoughts kept wandering." A third said, "I felt peace, but it came and went." Kosen nodded. "All good observations. But tell me what was constant through it all." The monks were silent. "The witness," Kosen said, "the one who noticed, the awareness behind all sounds, thoughts, and sensations that never moved, that is stillness." He looked at each of them. "Do not mistake silence for stillness. Silence can be broken. Stillness cannot. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace." That night, the monks returned to the monastery changed. They no longer meditated with the intent to reach something. They simply sat, allowing life to unfold. The sound of rain became their mantra. The flicker of candlelight became their teacher. The rise and fall of their own breath became scripture written in air. Days passed in wordless understanding. When the young monk, the same one who had once mourned the library, approached Kosen days later, his eyes shone with curiosity. "Master," he said, "how do we keep this stillness when the world grows loud again? When pain or anger arise, how do we remain unmoved?" Kosen placed a hand over the young monk's heart. "Stillness is not something you keep," he said. "It is what you are. When you forget, life will remind you. When you resist, suffering will remind you. When you listen again, stillness returns not because it came back, but because it never left." He smiled. "Even the wind that howls through the valley does not disturb the mountain. Be the mountain." That evening, As twilight deepened, the monks gathered by the fire pit where their library once stood. Kosen sat with them, his face illuminated by the soft glow. He began to speak again, his tone low and rhythmic, like a lullaby. "Many years ago," he said, "I thought wisdom was something to add to myself, knowledge, rituals, virtues. But wisdom is not addition, it is a subtraction. The wise are not those who know more, but those who cling less." He picked up a handful of ashes from the ground, letting them fall slowly through his fingers. This was once a library, but even now the ashes feed the soil. The soil feeds the plants feed the fire. Nothing is lost, only transformed. He looked into the flames. So too with our pain. When you stop resisting it, your sorrow becomes fuel for compassion. Your fear becomes courage. Your confusion becomes clarity. The fire that burns you is the same fire that illumines your path. The monks listened, silent and still. The night air was cool. The sound of a distant waterfall echoed faintly in the valley. Kosen's voice softened even further. "One day, even this body will return to ash, but the awareness that witnesses its coming and going that cannot die, that is what you are. That is the stillness beneath all motion." He fell silent, letting the fire crackle and the stars emerge above them one by one. As the night deepened, something shifted among the monks. They were no longer seeking peace. They had become peace. The rustle of the trees, the whisper of the wind, the flicker of fire, all of it was part of one vast, breathing presence. No one spoke, yet everything was understood. The young monk closed his eyes and smiled faintly. He could feel the stillness Kosen spoke of, not as an idea, but as a quiet pulse within every heartbeat of the world. "The world is always speaking," Kosen once said, "but only in stillness can you hear it whisper your name." Night descended softly over the monastery. The valley, once alive with wind and birdsong, now rested beneath a quilt of silence. The moon rose slow and silver, draping its calm light over the tiled roofs, the quiet garden, and the sleeping pines. Kosen sat alone beneath the Bodhi tree at the edge of the courtyard. His old robe shimmered faintly in the moonlight, his posture perfectly still, yet relaxed like a mountain at peace with the wind. The air was cool, the world hushed. One by one, the monks finished their evening chants and drifted quietly to their sleeping quarters. Only the young monk lingered, hesitating at the door, watching his teacher in the moonlight. "Master," he whispered, "may I sit with you a while?" Kosen nodded without opening his eyes. The young monk crossed the courtyard and sat beside him, the stones still warm from the day's sun. For a long while, neither spoke. There was no need to. The sound of the night was enough, the soft rustle of leaves, the steady rhythm of breath, the faint hum of crickets rising and falling like waves on an unseen shore. After a time, the monk spoke softly. "Master, you have taught us about impermanence, about stillness, about letting go. But when I lie awake at night, sometimes I still feel a quiet fear, the fear of not being enough, of disappearing." Kosen opened his eyes. The moonlight reflected in them like two calm lakes. "Do you hear the stream, my son?" The monk tilted his head. From somewhere beyond the courtyard came the faint murmur of water moving over stone. "It flows endlessly," said Kosen, "yet no drop of it tries to last. Each one appears, glitters for a moment, and then joins the next. None are lost, none are separate. The stream only seems to move, but in truth it is always whole." He turned toward the monk. You too are like that. You think you are a single drop, this body, this name, this life. But in truth, you are the stream itself. The fear comes only when the drop forgets it is water. The monk closed his eyes, feeling the words settle over him like a warm blanket. The night air brushed his face, his breath softened. The world seemed to slow, every sound stretching into stillness. Kosen's voice lowered to a whisper, calm, gentle, endless. When the mind grows quiet, the heart remembers what it has always known. You are not the waves, you are the ocean. You are not the clouds passing through the sky, you are the sky itself. The monk's shoulders relaxed. His thoughts, once darting like restless fish, began to drift. He could feel sleep approaching, not as an escape, but as a soft return, a homecoming. Kosen looked at the stars above. "Look," he said softly, "how even the stars rest. They shine without trying. They burn without effort. The universe does not strive to be beautiful. It simply is." He turned his gaze to the young monk, whose eyes were now half closed, his breathing slow and deep. "When you sleep tonight," Kosen whispered, "let go of who you think you are. Let your mind float like a leaf on the river. Let each breath carry you deeper into stillness. You do not need to reach peace, for peace has already found you." The monk nodded faintly, drifting. His last waking memory was of Kosen's voice blending with the wind, soft, steady, eternal. And then all was silence. The fireflies flickered across the courtyard. The moon climbed higher. The stream sang its gentle, endless song. Somewhere in the quiet heart of the night, even the old master closed his eyes. There was nothing left to seek, nothing left to learn, only the infinite stillness breathing through all things. "Sleep now, traveler," the world seemed to whisper. "You are safe. You are home. You are the quiet beneath the stars."